There's been a lot of discussion recently about the whole effort to Memartabatkan Bahasa Melayu in Malaysia, which is basically the effort to reinforce the national language. A lot of people actually have expressed fear and disdain towards this particular policy. A lot of people think that the effort is basically the Malaysian government's attempt to shut down the usage of the English language. English is, of course, the language of science, international commerce, and a whole lot of other things. And if it comes under threat, it's natural that people would respond adversely. But there's a huge difference between wanting to quote-unquote memartabatkan, or to reinforce the usage of the Malay language, and excluding the English language. They are not the same thing. But we'll break down some of these claims and opinions, and let's go. Two main claims. Number one, the PM wants civil service members to only speak in Malay. Claim number two, the Prime Minister wants Malay to be the lingua franca, wants to only speak Malay during national meetings and even at international fora. Let's look at these claims one after another to see if they're legit. Claim number one. People in the civil service are not allowed to speak English. If they speak English, then they'll get punished for doing so. Newsflash, this is fake news. To think about it, I'm actually kind of unsurprised that people think that civil servants are going to get punished, because that's what the news media seems to be reporting. That is the impression that it is creating. And you wouldn't know it unless you actually knew how to read between the lines. Unfortunately, most people end up getting confused between fact and bias and cherry pick what they want to hear so it confirms their worldview. Sure, you can believe whatever you want, but just because you believe something doesn't make it true. Ultimately though, you can probably collect all the evidence that you want, but it's still going to lead you to the wrong conclusion if you don't reason correctly with it. Like, for example, see, if you just read this headline right here, you could be forgiven for thinking that that is actually telling you that there are punitive measures for the civil service if people don't speak Malay, but that is literally just a letter to the editor. And if you look at this next headline right here, it says encourage, not punish. The first line of the article says it's not right to enforce the use of Bahasa Malaysia in the civil service. And if you don't actually go and look at the real situation, then you might actually think that there is a punishment, although that's not necessarily the case. You actually do have to go ahead and research that a little bit further and go to the original source of all of this right here. Original Berita Harian report only indicated that it was a suggestion. So just because something is suggested, it doesn't mean that it will actually be implemented. Look across multiple different news media sources right here. You will probably find no indication that these sorts of penalties or punishments are a matter of Malaysian law. Also, such punishments would be difficult to implement and near impossible to enforce. Let me now take you through an interesting case featuring, well, maybe not an average civil servant, but a civil servant nonetheless. Health Minister Khairy Jamaluddin recently went to Harvard University to attend the Harvard Ministerial Leadership Program. Since Khairy is a civil servant and his case basically came after the controversy about the policy was put into place, a lot of netizens started asking, would Khairy have to start speaking Malay when he got to Harvard? Guess not, but still. People made many comments about his case as a civil servant, wrongly suggesting that he should be speaking Malay. But even if a ban on English existed, either this doesn't apply to KJ or he hasn't gotten the memo.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Madam President, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen.
But how would you enforce this policy? Would you, assign someone to watch KJ at the moment he says, the Right Honorable Assembly, then the representative right there just goes all like, hey, jangan boss. Also, this isn't an isolated case either. If we want to go even further into the very heart of Putrajaya, I went over to the Dewan Bahasa for the KL International Book Fair, had a chat with Dewan Bahasa on the way to watching my friend Jack. I said, but then our friends replied to me in English.
Our top set.
Your top set?
One of our top set.
Oh, serious?
You can shoot the
Is it? Okay, wow, that is cool. Thank you so much. Thank you. Should Dewan Bahasa punish itself? Alright, let's now go to claim number two. The PM wants Malay to be the lingua franca of Southeast Asia. In response to this, at least 3 people have gone up to me and they have told me that they are just terrified at the way that Malaysia is going. They are afraid that we're going to make an embarrassment of ourselves on the international stage because we will be speaking Malay in situations where everybody will be speaking English. Not true. Consider this example. Okay, so the article title is Let's Make Malay the Lingua Franca Again. But when you actually read it, PM Sabri is quoted as saying Malay can be made one of the official languages of ASEAN. Yes, you're absolutely right. One of the official languages of ASEAN doesn't mean the lingua franca of ASEAN. Not the same thing. It has been specifically mentioned that he wants to use Malay as the second language spoken of Southeast Asia. Malay would be one of the languages that happens to be used alongside English. That is a massive freaking misreporting. But wait, isn't it true that he wants civil servants to correspond only in Malay? To that I say, trust me, it's not as bad as you think.
Semua segala menjurat daripada negara kita ke luar, sama ada saya sebagai Perdana Menteri kepada rakan sejawat saya, Perdana Menteri atau Presiden, menggunakan bahasa Melayu. Tapi kita lampirkan terjemahan dalam bahasa Inggeris bersama surat. Kita gunakan bahasa Melayu di negara yang bercakap bahasa mereka. Tapi di negara yang bercakap bahasa Inggeris, kita masih memberi option, masih memberi pilihan. Sama ada ingin berbahasa Melayu ataupun berbahasa Inggeris.
He's not saying that you can only use the national language even when people are speaking to you in English. The whole point of communication is that somebody speaks with you and then you speak back in a language that is possible to communicate in. If there is no actual way to respond, then there is no communication. If we were to literally just speak Malay all the while and then just have people like stare at us awkwardly, that's not communication. Like, we wouldn't be able to accomplish anything. Why even send a delegation? In a situation where you have the chance to speak your national language in, for example, the ASEAN roundtable meetings, there's nothing wrong or controversial with that. Check this example out and you understand what I mean.
Kapan perekonomian akan segera pulih dan tumbuh inklusif?
As you can see right there was no problem with President Jokowi speaking in Bahasa Indonesia that was interpreted. It is something that is completely non-controversial that other countries do as well. I think that maybe the misstep that the Malaysian government made was just not coming out and explaining that that was exactly what it was going to do, because if it had just provided an example of how that could be done, then that would have been infinitely easier than just going out, speaking to the media, and having everything taken out of context like that. On the other hand, if you have something like a meeting at the WHO, then
We should build back better, but equitably, with no country left behind. In Malay, we have a saying, berat sama dipikul, ringan sama dijinjing. We must not only share in the pain, but also share in the cure and the recovery.
And I hope that shows you that Malay can be used on the international stage alongside English with no issues whatsoever. In closing this video, I would like to express that it's worthwhile to think about the way that people have been opposed to the effort to Memartabatkan Bahasa Melayu recently. People get extremely emotional when it comes to the English language because they have the intuitive sense that the English language is the language of science, technology, literature, and culture for future life prospects. There are many good reasons for parents to want to have their children learn English really well. But at the same time though, I appreciate that the country is not trying to stop the English language from being learned. On a more controversial note, I do feel that the public does have a responsibility to the government. To express this, I'd like to use the Malay peribahasa or idiom, bertepuk sebelah tangan tidak akan berbunyi. And that basically means that if you try to clap with only one hand, then no sound is going to be made. Without the benefit of an educated civil society that critiques and reads and understands what happens in the news on a day-to-day basis, no matter how good government communication happens to be, if the people of this country don't develop good habits of critical reading and understanding information from a variety of different sources, then eventually the leaders that rise up from this community are probably going to repeat some of the same mistakes that the current generation happen to be criticizing. We should, for the sake of our civil society and for our community, develop ourselves so that we can become more conscientious and critical readers, so that we can actually hold the government to account and to not misunderstand it, but instead to be able to appreciate what it is actually saying, so that we do not end up deceiving ourselves. I hope that this video showed you that there is no concerted effort on the part of the Malaysian administration to shut down the English language. In a world like this, we can actually help both Malay and English to coexist. It's not a zero-sum game. But this choice as to whether to use the Malay language or to use the English language, it is a choice at the end of the day. When I go over from, let's say, Hari Raya celebrations or stuff of that nature right there, although I know a lot of different Malay families, it's also the case that a lot of the families I interact with, although they're Malay, they speak with me in English. Whether or not you can actually successfully memartabatkan the Malay language is not entirely up to you as the government, but it's also entirely up to the will of the people. From what I can see from the will of the people at the moment, it may be possible, but it's just somewhat unlikely unless some organic or specific reasons are in place for the people to actually use it on a day-to-day basis. In the past, a lot of times people have been telling us in school, speak Bahasa Melayu, but the whole point of a language is to communicate. And if we are forced into communication right there, then we're not going to want to communicate, and that's going to not really contribute towards the growth of the Malay language in the long run, even though in the short run, maybe a couple of us might choose to speak the Malay language a little bit more because of this government campaign that's being conducted right there. If people don't have an organic reason to use Malay, then no matter how hard you campaign or no matter what you do, people are not going to use the language and eventually the campaign will fail. If you want to maximize the chance that people will end up speaking Malay just naturally, consider things like Korean dramas, anime, things that make people just want to automatically learn the language without being forced to. If you can find like lots of genuine and real reasons for people to actually use the Malay language, then you don't even need to run a campaign. People will just come to it automatically.